애들이 와서 이제 저를 잡아가게 됐고,
비둘기 고문 같은 경우에는 매달아 놓고 나가면 됩니다. 그러니까 앉지도 서지도 못하니까 잠도 못 잡니다. 그렇게 한 3, 4일씩 매달아 놓으면 사람이 마다납니다.
그릇에다 물 또는 그 그릇에다 그 물에다가 아이를 뒤집어 놓으라는 겁니다.
The testimonies of the victims were grim and heart-wrenching. The 370-page UN report reveals the scope of human rights violations by the North Korean regime, to the shock and horror of the international community. The truth behind the human rights conditions in the North has gotten the attention of the international community. On today's Upfront, we discuss the remaining challenges for the Korean government as well as the international community as it tries to improve the human rights conditions in the North.
Welcome to Upfront. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Na Hyun-kyung.
I'm Yu Jong-soo.
And as we just saw, today's topic is North Korea's human rights, and we have two very special guests joining us in the studio. On our right is Ambassador Lee Jong-Un, the South Korean Ambassador for Human Rights. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
And retired Judge Michael Kirby, also the former chair of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Kirby, the Commission of Inquiry of Human Rights in North Korea published about 400-page report in February. How is this report different from the other UN reports?
Well, it's a report by an inquiry, a commission of inquiry, which is quite a high-level report within the UN system. It is a report which is devoted entirely to the issues of human rights in North Korea. It covers the whole range. We had a mandate with 9 subject areas that we had to cover. And the most unusual aspect of it was we proceeded by way of public hearings. Normally, the process of commissions of inquiry have been by private consultations and efficient gathering of the data, but because we were not permitted to go into North Korea, we thought it was important for us to conduct public hearings, as we did, including here in Seoul. And that was something new, and it allowed the victims to speak very directly to the highest levels of the United Nations and also to the international community.
And the UN Commission of Inquiry, the commission that you headed last year, was actually established by the Human Rights Council last year. What was the significance behind the UN's decision to launch such a commission of inquiry?
I think the most significant fact is that it was established without a vote. In every other case, this is the only time in the history of the Human Rights Council that an inquiry has been set up without a vote. The President called several times to see if anybody wanted to have a vote on it, but it indicated that the international community represented in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations had reached a point that it really thought this was an extremely serious matter, that it called for a very high-level, independent, impartial investigation, and that is what we set about doing, and that is what we delivered. We delivered it on time, within budget. It is readable, and it is available online for anyone in the world to see it.
The COI report indicates Kim Jong-un as a leader responsible for this human rights violation in North Korea. Some expected that Kim Jong-un would improve human rights situation in North Korea since he studied abroad. And Ambassador Lee, how has North Korea changed the human rights situation from the time that Kim Jong-un took power, and for better or for worse?
Well, I mean, one thing that can be said with certainty is that there's not been an improvement in the human rights conditions in North Korea under the new leadership of Kim Jong-un. Yes, he was educated in part in Switzerland, so Western education. He seems to like American basketball, NBA. He invites someone like Dennis Rodman. So there was this sort of wishful thinking that perhaps because he's been exposed to the outside world, that at the helm of this highly closed cocoon society, that maybe he might turn things around. But unfortunately, he's basically carrying on the legacies of his father and his grandfather and acting like a monarchy, just as his father did and his grandfather did. In fact, I would argue that even worse, because a few months ago, I think he shocked the world by briefly executing his own uncle, who is, of course, the husband of his father's sister and the number 2 person. So if he can do that to the elite of them all, Jang Sung-taek, then can you imagine what he will be doing to normal people without status? So he will be probably treating them like dirt. And there's already been signs of huge range of purging going on, particularly those people who are in the Jang Sung-taek circle. We don't know the extent of that because they probably do it in a secret manner. Sometimes they do it publicly as a show of force of the strength of this regime. But whilst all this is going on, we're not really getting any sort of improvement. It's not like they're shutting down their political prison camps. It's not like they're allowing free movement of the people or the freedom of religion or any of the 30 indicators of that's in the UN Charter or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Mr. Kirby, were you also disappointed by how Kim Jong-un was handling the human rights situation in his own regime?
Well, like Ambassador Lee, I was hoping that he would bring to bear the attitudes of a younger generation, that he would consider closer person-to-person contacts on the Korean Peninsula. After all, the division is an artificial one forced on the Korean people at the end of the Second World War by outside powers. It had no vote or decision of the Korean people at the time. And for the life of me, I can't see why dentists or agricultural scientists cannot meet together and discuss matters which are in common, why people can't send letters to each other, why there can't be telephone contacts. It's really a cruel and inhumane approach to human existence. And I think there was a lot of hope that that would change with a younger person with some contacts with the West, but the plain fact of the matter is it hasn't, and if anything, things appear to have become more draconian, and that isn't a good development.
And all the hearings that you conducted, they took place outside of North Korea, and you did ask for Pyongyang's cooperation before, but it was denied.
Not only did we ask for it, but the resolution of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations of the world urged North Korea to fully cooperate with the Commission of Inquiry and to allow access to the places. Obviously, it would have been better if we could have gone in, but in the end, we had no difficulty getting testimony. We had to cut off the testimony because we had so many responses to our invitation for people to come forward. There are 26,000 people from North Korea living just in the Republic of Korea in South Korea, and we had a lot of evidence on all of our 9 mandate points, and the important point is, in our report, we quoted on every page or every second page, there's a quote from a person who's gone through the real living experience of the subject matter of human rights deprivation, and they speak very vividly, and interestingly they spoke in a very low-key way. They were not inflamed, they were not emotional, they just told their story, and it's online. And when North Korea said they were human scum, we could say just have a look at it yourself. Have a look online. They can't do that in North Korea because only the elite have access to the internet, but the rest of the world can look and see and learn and listen and judge, and that's what they can do on the COI report.
The COI report is dependent upon the testimonies of the North Korean defectors who have left or escaped from North Korea long ago. Some have raised concerns that this report might not reflect the current situations in North Korea. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, not all of the witnesses were long ago. Some of them were within the space of 2 years or so from their departure. Secondly, we did have some objective testimony. For example, North Korea denied the existence of political prison camps, but the witnesses were able to give exact locations, and we were then able to go to information of satellite images available to us through Amnesty International and other organizations, and Google Earth, just looking at the satellite images that you can look at and get down to a very high precision, and they pour out the testimony of the witnesses. So we were not really concerned about the truthfulness or the up-to-dateness of the evidence. We were concerned at the fact that there was no real effective response to this testimony, and it stands as an international testament of the courage of individuals, their determination to seek freedom and human rights, and the fact that on this occasion, for all its occasional faults, the United Nations did the right thing. Set up the inquiry, it properly funded it, it set it to work, and we operated in this somewhat unusual way of public hearings so that the whole world could judge us as we performed the duty of bringing to bear the human rights criteria on the conduct of North Korea.
And such as yourself and as well as Ambassador Yi as well, there are many scholars, politicians, and activists who are trying and striving to improve the human rights conditions in North Korea. We had a chance to meet 3 experts, and why don't we take a look at this first interview we had with Professor Yoon Nam-gun. He's also the commissioner of the National Human Rights Commission of Korea.
Commissioners from the UN Commission of Inquiry, including Chairman Michael Kirby, visited Korea last year for a field survey on North Korean human rights conditions. After going through a lot of difficulties, they have released an amazing report on the grave human rights violations by the North. I would like to say thank you for all their efforts. Ambassador Yi has also strived to improve North Korean human rights. I also appreciate his efforts. I don't think there is any more we could ask from them. Legislating the North Korean Human Rights Bill is an important issue. Several different kinds of bills have been proposed since 2005, but none have been passed. The same situation has been repeated since 2005. The Korean government should be actively involved in the legislation of the North Korean Human Rights Bill.
So Professor Yoon urges South Korea's National Assembly to pass such a legislation. Would passing a bill make any difference, though?
I think so. Well, first of all, I do a lot of my activities in the global stage, go to United Nations, go to lots of international conferences, and it's quite embarrassing that to tell my foreign friends that Korea, this is a human rights violations case on the Korean Peninsula. And yet, in South Korea, our National Assembly, the legislators, fail to pass this North Korean human rights bill for the past 10 years. So it's been 10 years, a decade, despite the human rights violations, which is now recognized and actions being taken by the international community. The United States has passed this law long ago in 2004. They even have a North Korean human rights ambassador, Robert King. Japan has North Korean human rights law. The EU passed North Korean human rights resolution. So the whole world is paying attention to the North Korean human rights. Other countries are passing this law to support those NGOs and other activities dealing with North Korean human rights, trying to make sure that there's even a smallest bit of improvement in the human rights condition, and yet we're not doing that. How this could help? Well, first of all, it would set up a human rights records office, which the United Nations will be doing, by the way, and that's something that I guess we can be talking about later. But it will be setting up our own version of the Human Rights Violations Records Office, and this is something that they've had before the unification of Germany. In West Germany, they had this office keeping track of human rights violations in East Germany, and something like 80,000 human rights violations cases were recorded. And this became a very important foundation for what would turn out to be prosecution of those who are responsible after the unification. And therefore, just the mere existence of such an office was, I think, a deterrent in making people, before they commit human rights violations, for example, firing at those people who are trying to escape East Germany, they're thinking twice that if I do this, if we get reunified, will I get prosecuted later on? And I think that's the kind of psychology that we want to make sure that we instill in North Korea, but we're not doing that. So obviously, there are many ways that the passing of the North Korean human rights law could help to improve in providing budgets for all those NGOs that's working to improve the human rights conditions. And we're not able to do that because we don't have the legislation.
The people who are responsible for the brutal violation of human rights in North Korea should be punished. How do we hold these people, including Kim Jong-un, accountable?
Well, that's an essential question that the Commission of Inquiry addressed in its report. In the United Nations circles, where I have come from to this inquiry, there's constant talk about human rights up front, constant talk about the responsibility to protect, where governments don't protect their citizens from crimes against humanity, which the COI considered had been demonstrated in this case. It is the responsibility of the international community. So we went through the possibilities, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an ad hoc special tribunal for North Korea, a prosecutor set up. We went through them all, and in the end we concluded that the most effective solution would be to refer the case of North Korea to the International Criminal Court. Now, North Korea is not a party to the statute setting up that court, but there is another way in which that court can secure jurisdiction, which is by resolution of the Security Council. That then runs into the possible difficulties of the veto of any of the great powers who don't concur in it. But my feeling is that there is a recognition that this is a very special and very serious and grave case. Crimes have been going on for decades and something has to be done. So my hope is that ultimately the proposal of the Commission of Inquiry of referral of the case of North Korea to the International Criminal Court will be negotiated. It'll take time, but I'm hopeful that this is something that will be done because it's the most direct way into getting action immediately, including against the Supreme Leader. He is in command, and there is a principle of international law that people who are in command and can stop crimes against humanity or genocide and don't do so, then they personally become responsible.
Yeah, if I could just add one more very important aspect about the crimes against humanity. I mean, we hear about it very commonly, but I would just like to emphasize the fact that crimes against humanity is the worst kind of crime in international law. And when something is designated as crimes against humanity or genocide, like in the case of North Korea, there is no time limit. So, I mean, of course, we will very much like to jump to prosecution and prosecutory mechanism right away, maybe in 2014. But there are very elaborate organizational mechanism at the United Nations, so it may take a little time. But that's okay, because it could be next year, But what I'm saying is that it could be 10 years down the line. The crimes that's been charged as crimes against humanity remains valid. It just doesn't, get erased. 10 years from now, 30 years down the line. We saw how it was with the Holocaust after World War II. We see the Israeli Jewish community pursuing the Nazi perpetrators of Holocaust. So some 20 years, 40 years down the line, they find someone in Argentina hiding away. So that's the kind of effect that I think we want to have, and I think that's the important psychological effect of talking about crimes against humanity. Just the fact that although it may be a while before we actually go to the ICC, can you imagine that like 2-3 years ago, it was very hard to imagine that in one sentence that we will be talking about Kim Jong-Un, ICC, prosecution, and we're talking about it. That's a huge leap forward in dealing with North Korean human rights issue by the international community, and therefore I think that's huge kudos to the COI report because I think it really drew a new chapter in dealing with the human rights issue of North Korea, and as we move forward.
So what's important is that progress is being made.
Absolutely. In progress in terms of dealing with the North Korean human rights condition, not necessarily progress as is in North Korea, but what I'm saying is that all these activities and movement in dealing with North Korean human rights is bound to have an effect somewhere down the line.
And now meet Professor Jae-sung Ho, former Korean ambassador for human rights.
또 전 세계 많은 사람들은
A lot of people around the world are still not familiar with the North Korean human rights issue, but the international community, especially the UN Security Council, spared no effort to eliminate South Africa's system of legalized racial discrimination known as apartheid.
유엔 차원에서의
I hope efforts put forth by Chairman Kirby can draw the world's attention on the issue and promote cooperation between people who contributed to human rights issue or democratization in the past, like Aung San Suu Kyi, and renowned political leaders around the world. We need them to raise their voice for improving the human rights issue in North Korea.
정치 지도자들을 또 하나 더 덧붙이자면
Also, there have been ongoing discussions on submitting the matter to the International Criminal Court. And as you already know, members of the UN Security Council, including China and Russia, have remained cautious on the issue. I wonder what kind of strategy Chairman Kirby will take to persuade them.
입장을 갖고 있고.
All right, so Professor Chae wants to know how China and Russia could be convinced.
Well, China and Russia are great powers, and they are responsible for the use of the veto. And China, in particular, has been very prudent in the use of the veto. In the whole history of the People's Republic of China being in possession of the China seat in the Security Council, it has only used the veto on 10 occasions. This isn't generally known, but China is very careful in the use of the veto power. Similarly, the Russian Federation is now really largely disconnected from North Korea. It once was the great supporter of the economy of North Korea, but now it has historical connections, but it isn't really very closely linked to the regime in North Korea. So when it comes to answering the question of the crimes against humanity, I am hopeful that the great powers, and all of them, will reach a responsible decision. But even if they don't, there are plenty of other things that can be done. The collection of the testimony, the recording of it, the giving dignity to the people who have suffered and their families have suffered, respecting their testimony and archiving it, keeping it available for future action. But as well as that, the Commission of Inquiry report had a lot of other suggestions that had nothing to do with prosecution, people-to-people contacts, making far greater use of of individual connections between North and South Korea, opening things up, and technology is going to come to the aid of this opening up. You just can't cut people off as you could in the old days and require them to get approval if they left their village, which is the law in North Korea. Nowadays, more and more people are having access to their intranet and even to the internet. And it's a challenge for the Republic of Korea, for their blood relatives in North Korea, to make sure that they know what the United Nations has found in this inquiry, to make sure that the report of the Commission of Inquiry in the Korean language gets into North Korea. We offered to go there to answer criticisms, to answer questions, to submit ourselves to scrutiny and interrogation. That was not accepted, but the offer is still open. We will go there and we will justify this report and request answers on the part of the government of North Korea.
So it will be harder for China or Russia to veto when that does happen. Do you have any opinions on that, Ambassador Lee?
Well, I mean, all countries basically act out of their own national interest. Obviously, China and Russia are serving as sort of a patron to North Korea, despite North Korea's rogue status and misbehaviors, because they probably think continuing to do so, despite the international criticism, has some benefit to their countries. So I think it falls on the international community, particularly South Korea, to keep convincing Russia and China. And China is a very pragmatic country, that continuing to do that, supporting North Korea, really is counterproductive to Chinese national interest. By not doing that is more beneficial to China. For example, I mean, we're of course going a little forward, but if there was unification, peaceful and democratic unification, what kind of the fallover effect will that have on China? China's one of the main goals in terms of economic development is the northeast region, Jilin and so on, and the three provinces. Can you imagine a unified Korea under democratic leadership, the spillover effect that would have on the three provinces in northeast of China? That could really, I believe, initiate a second economic boom for China. You know that Chinese economy is slowly shrinking. It's going down, and therefore it needs that kind of a spark, and that could be provided by Korean unification. So I believe that, and of course China wants to play the G2 role. China wants to compete with the United States as a global leader. What kind of a global leader turns blind eye to crimes against humanity? Even Botswana, it's not a superpower. After the COI report made a very clear statement saying that we're not going to have diplomatic relations with a country that commits crimes against humanity. And they severed, after 40 years of normal relations, severed their diplomatic relations with North Korea. So I believe that as we move forward, China will come to the realization that this is just too much of a burden to carry North Korea. There's just too much criticism. Nothing is in the interest of China. And when that moment happens, I believe that China will come on board on a value that is universally accepted on this issue of human rights.
Well, promote the human rights in North Korea. Ambassador Lee, you have taken an interesting approach by sending letters to celebrities like Angelina Jolie and Oprah Winfrey. So how did you get this idea, and what kind of result that do you expect?
Well, unfortunately, my letters have not been responded to yet. So I hope they're watching this program, and maybe one of them will decide to write back. The point is this, I can say this 1,000 times, but a global celebrity, like, as you say, Angelina Jolie or George Clooney, they can just say one thing about North Korean human rights violations and that the world should not stand for this. And I think it carries so much weight. So many people will be listening to that. And in the general audience in the world, unfortunately, despite the atrocious conditions of human rights in North Korea, people are just not aware of what's going on. I mean, North Korea has been very, very good at hiding what goes on in that country. So people just don't know. So when such celebrated people, famous people, in even a very short, like 1 minute YouTube video, talk about these things, it could have a tremendous effect. And that's what I'm hoping for.
Ambassador Lee never gives up. He's been trying to get me to speak to
very
Kylie
persistent,
Minogue
I
and
guess.
a few Australians. And of course in the AIDS struggle, in the struggle against HIV/AIDS, where also the UN has given a great leadership. Often it's people in the entertainment industry and Hollywood and so on who have been foremost in speaking up for human rights in that field. So it's not a crazy idea, it's a good idea, and I think Ambassador Lee should stick to it.
Ambassador Lee, you also had a huge role in establishing the Human Liberty Center at Yonsei University. What are some of the projects that you're leading in the center? Well,
one of the key things that I hope to pursue, it was established in January. We're interested in making short videos because I think it's very important to send out the message and increase the awareness of the North Korean human rights conditions. So we're about making shortcut videos. It could be the North Korean defectors. It could be experts on the issue. It could be celebrities who would say some things on North Korean human rights conditions, and it will be put on the YouTube so that as many people can just click in and hear in just short span of time what's going on. So that I think international awareness is very, very important in drawing the global awareness, and I think and also putting pressure on respective governments to do something at the UN. So it could carry strong weight, and that's what I'm basically trying to do. We have 2 videos, and I hope to make many more. Another aspect is that we have a very close links with a major international law firm in London called Hogan Lovells, and they've actually pro bono, without payment, helped to come up with a second opinion of the COI report. They've actually come up with about 100-page report of their own, talking about the legitimacy of the COI report. And this is coming from a global law firm, so it can only help to substantiate the COI report. And this is going to actually be publicly released in June. There's going to be a U.S. congressional hearing in mid-part of June. And this report I will be releasing as I participate in that hearing.
All right, so let's take a moment here, and we have our third interview ready. Let's meet Director Park Seok-gil. He's the Director of Research and Strategy for Liberty in North Korea. Let's see what he had to say.
So I think that it's really important to have attention on not just the seriousness of the challenges that North Korean people face, but also the ways that the North Korean people are beginning to overcome those challenges in really incredible ways as well. So for instance, the North Korean government is infamous for denying the North Korean people their freedom of information. But North Korean people are increasingly using smuggled Chinese mobile phones and portable DVD players, USBs, even micro SD chips to consume foreign media and overcome those restrictions and start to learn more about the outside world. And I think that it's really important to have more attention on that, because also in those people-driven changes, there lies the opportunities for the outside world to try and accelerate those progress as well.
It could be impossible to improve human rights if there were a regime change in North Korea. With that in mind, the concept of responsibility to protect has been discussed. Would you please elaborate on this subject?
Yes. Well, first of all, on regime change, we were often accused by the government of North Korea or its news agency of being proponents of regime change, whereas we were not. And the reason for that was we are a unit of the United Nations. North Korea is a member of the United Nations, and it wasn't for a unit to say, well, we disrespect the fact that a member state is a member and there should be a change of administration or even the abolition of the state. So we never said that. We said if you join the United Nations, if you sign the Charter, if you sign the international human rights treaties, you are accountable. You have to live up to what you have promised to do. Now, responsibility to protect is a principle which has been adopted in recent years in the United Nations, where it appears that a country's government will not protect its people from grave international crimes. Crimes against humanity of the kind that the Commission of Inquiry has found exist in North Korea, they require action, and the government of North Korea is pretty obviously not providing the protection to the population. And therefore, this is a case where it really summons forth the international community. It requires of governments generally and of the United Nations system in particular to step into the shoes of the government that is failing to give protection and to take responsible action. And of course this is one of the reasons why the proposal of the COI to refer the case of North Korea to the International Criminal Court, that really is an instance of R2P, responsibility to protect. It's an instance of saying the government is not going to do it, therefore we will transfer this into the international organ that can render accountable those who are not protecting their own population.
But how likely is it for the R2P measures to be carried out? I mean, it includes military intervention as well, right?
It can, but that's not a necessary measure, and certainly we never proposed in the COI report military intervention in the fragile circumstances of this peninsula and this region of the world and the dangers that would be posed. That is not an agenda which we put forward. But we did put forward the peaceful, institutional, independent international judiciary, the International Criminal Court, to be a place where North Korea could have its say. It could provide its defence. We asked them to come to us. We asked them, we even made arrangements for them to be given diplomatic protection, to come along to our public hearings, to make their submissions, to ask questions of the witnesses. All of that they refused. Their tactic is non-engagement. Well, non-engagement is coming to an end, and the international community now has a really good idea of what is happening in North Korea, and I believe that is the foundation of truth on which the people of Korea, the people of South Korea and the international community will demand that there be action. More talk, more reports, gathering dust, that's not the way to go in this case. This is really a very great affront to the international community, and action must be taken to render accountable those who commit crimes against humanity. It's just a basic rule of living together on this small blue planet.
Well, Ambassador Lee, do you also think, what do you think about, what are your thoughts on the R2P measures perhaps being carried out on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, it's a principle, and it's a very good principle because there's a international consensus that people ought to be protected, that certain rights ought to be honored. And the primary agent that's supposed to be responsible for that is the state, right? But if the state is not providing that protection, and in fact, the state is the culprit of taking away that right from its own people, then the international community has the responsibility to intervene and make right what is wronged. Now, that, as Justice Kirby has pointed out, does not necessarily mean military intervention. It's not humanitarian intervention. It could mean sanctions. It could mean a lot of other ways. But the pure thought of the international community taking on the responsibility, feeling the responsibility, it's something happening that's in another state, so they're on their own. That's not the case here. That we should all feel the responsibility to bring about justice, so that the basic minimum rights of the people is protected. And in that sense, I think already the fact that the Commission of Inquiry was set up and that there's this field base that's going to be soon established in South Korea. The ARIA meeting, the Security Council, although informally, talking about ICC referral, the international community is already engaged and intervening. So the sense of the responsibility to protect has already kicked in. And it's just a question of how far do we go from here.
All right, we have one more guest that we would like to talk to. Joining us from Geneva is Ambassador Choi Seok-young. He's the South Korea's ambassador to the UN mission in Geneva. Thank you for your time, Ambassador Choi, for joining us today. Now, I hear you recommend the book titled Escape from Camp 14 to a lot of people that you meet in Geneva. Why is this book so special to you?
Because this book is written by the reporter of the Washington Post, telling the story of North Korean refugees who was born in the prisoners camp, political prisoners camp, and then he was bred up in the camp, and then he escaped this prisoners camp in the North Korea. Therefore, the story is telling the vivid and the real story of the human rights violations in North Korea.
Do you think the UN is making progress on tackling North Korea's human rights violations?
Yes, in the United Nations system, after the establishment of Human Rights Council, this council adopted every year a resolution regarding North Korea's human rights situations. And this council also established a special rapporteur on the situation of North Korean human rights. And then this special rapporteur, Dr. Darsman, has also reported his own findings on North Korea's human rights violation. He just concluded that in North Korea there are 9 types of serious human rights violation, and this violation is serious and grave, widespread, and systemic.
Now, we've been having a lengthy discussion here in the studio, but you also believe the role of the international community is crucial.
Yeah, the first thing for the international community should do in improving North Korea's human rights situation is to best implement the recommendations by the COI and also the elements contained in the resolution which was adopted in Human Rights Council in March this year. And then secondly, international community should work together to enhance the public awareness on the serious human rights violation situations of North Korea. In order to do so, last April, the Security Council of the United Nations held a kind of ARIA briefing sessions, just delivering the COI report much more in detail in publicities.
How can the South Korean government make more contribution?
The Korean government has participated in the making of a number of resolutions to improve North Korea's human rights situation so far. And then Korea will continue to sponsor such kind of UN resolutions in order to improve North Korean people's human rights situation. And number 2, Korea will also cooperate with United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights in the operation of the field-based structure, which will be established in Korea in this year to improve the human rights situations of North Korea. And then thirdly, Korean government will consider that the human rights issues in North Korea should be understood as a universal rights of the human beings. Therefore, Korea will continue to work together with international community to improve the situations.
All right, thank you very much, Ambassador Choi, for all your work and also for taking the time to talk to us today. All right, so Ambassador Choi also mentioned this, and we've also talked about it already, but a UN human rights field-based office will be opening up in Korea, in South Korea, hopefully in the latter half of this year. What kinds of results can we expect to see from the office?
Well, the modalities of this arrangement are still being worked out between the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Government of Republic of Korea, and announcements will be made within the next few weeks, I would think, about the detail. And to be frank, I'm not really completely aware of all the discussions and all the negotiations. My understanding is that it will be a relatively small office, at least at first. It will have Korean as well as international staff. It will be continuing the record-keeping work of the Commission of Inquiry, which is a very important step for the dignity and respect of people who have suffered crimes against humanity. But it will also be a body which will be, in a sense, the eyes and ears of the United Nations. And sometimes when you're very close to issues, you may not see them as clearly as outsiders can help you to see them, and I think that that may be part of the role which the United Nations will continue to play in the Korean Peninsula. We realise that there is a great sensitivity about this issue in Korea. There is a difference of view about humanitarian efforts and human rights efforts. The two really go together. Without a foundation of truth, you can't really build a just order, and without a foundation of truth, it's very difficult to foresee a just reconciliation and reunification of Korea. So it's all together, it's all part of a whole approach to the issues of the Korean Peninsula, and I hope that the United Nations, which was there during the Korean War, will play a very constructive role in the resolution, the ultimate resolution of that war and the resolution of the grave situation of human rights in North Korea.
Mr. Kirby, do you have any advice you would like to offer South Korean government in regards to North Korean human rights issues?
You recently had a meeting with President Park Geun-hye. Were you satisfied?
I was certainly very impressed by the President, and I was impressed by her sincerity. She is obviously and correctly concerned about the issue of reunification. In a sense, reunification holds out the prospect of the long-term resolution of many of the problems that have been discussed in this session and in the COI report. There is this debate in Korea. Can you turn your back on being too forward about human rights in the hope that that helps to resolve the problems in North Korea? And I think the experience of the United Nations has been that you have to build the future on the foundation of truth and respect for fundamental universal human rights. The North Korean ambassador at Geneva said, we have a saying in Korean, mind your own business. Well, in the international community, since the Charter of the United Nations and after the horrors of the Second World War, we decided that we would recognize universal human rights as part of the business of us all, that where there were grave affronts, we would have the United Nations investigate and we would put in steps requirements of accountability and correction. And that is what the United Nations has been doing. This is one case where the UN has done everything it should have done. And I hope that the Korean community will take up this challenge and will build relationships on a person-to-person basis, but not on a false basis, on a basis of truth, of revelation of grave human rights, and of accountability for those who are most responsible for the very great wrongs that have been done. And let the victims speak. Let the people speak, and they speak through the internet, and they speak in our public hearings, they speak through our report, and everyone in the world should be listening, and the world should act, and the United Nations should act. And that's what the COI report has said.
And on that note, Ambassador Lee, do you have any message, as a South Korean, do you have any message that you would like to get across to the international community as well as the UN?
No, I just want to thank Arirang TV for taking on this subject to which will only help to increase the awareness, which is a very important thing. And I also like to take this opportunity to thank Justice Kirby for a tremendous work he's done in producing what is a landmark text, the COI report. And this will serve to become the foundation and the bedrock of the international community's dealings with the human rights issues in North Korea. So thank you for that. And the work
I'm
really
going to try and get Kylie Minogue.
or Olivia Newton-John. She'll do good.
To send more letters too, right? All right.
So
I mean,
thank you.
yeah, that's all the time. Unfortunately, all the time we have for today. But thank you both for coming to the studio and taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you.
And that's going to wrap up this edition of Upfront.
Thanks for watching.
And we'll see you next week.